Greetings from the Tech Cave. Fenris here, and today we are taking a look at the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, this system was sent in to me by a friend of mine who said that they were having some reliability issues with it. And that's really no surprise given the fact that the most critical issue with these systems is this: the zero insertion force cartridge slot. And the reason why that is because when Nintendo of America was designing this system for the home entertainment market in 1985, they wanted the system to look less like a game system and more like a home appliance, like a VCR, if you will. And the reason for that is because they were releasing this system in the wake of the 1983 home video game crash that occurred here in North America. Now, it's worth noting that the crash only affected the home consoles at the time and not the arcade or the home computer scene. Now, why is that important? Well, because they designed it to operate more like a VCR, the way it would work is that you put your cartridge in, like so, press down, and hit power to play. Now, the issue with that is there is constant upward pressure being applied to the 72-pin cartridge connector here. And it wasn't uncommon for kids to just leave their games in here over myriads of days, just close it up, and get to gaming. And especially after they were done with like homework or it was the weekend or something like that, right? So as a result, there was always upward pressure being applied to the 72-pin connector. So in the event that they want to swap their game out, like so, they may find that it doesn't boot the first time, or they have to like jiggle it around or blow on the cartridge and whatnot. And the reason for that is because since there was so much upward pressure being applied throughout an extended period of time, the pins are now bent. So it's not going to make an adequate connection anymore. So what we're going to do is we are going to refurbish the original 72-pin connector, and I'll get into why that is later. And in addition, we're going to be freshening things up in the inside. So let's get this thing taken apart and get to work. All right, sorry about that, folks. Unfortunately, I was struggling a little bit to get this NES apart, mainly because, number one, the screwdriver here I decided to use isn't magnetized, so it wasn't able to pull up the screws as I was unscrewing them. And two, the connectors here were giving me a bit of trouble. They seem to be really snug, which I guess that's to be expected since this NES had never been opened before. But something to note, when removing these connectors, you want to go slow. You want to just grab both sides and just gently wiggle back and forth but be mindful of the bottom shielding. The bottom shielding is very sharp and you can cut yourself if you're going too fast. So just take your time, go slowly, and then eventually it'll loosen up and you can remove it. Now, with that out of the way, let's focus on the board. Now, the main source of our reliability issue is this, as I had mentioned previously. This, let me just get it out. This is our 72-pin zero insertion force connector. And as you can see, the pins, while not super flat, have definitely been flattened out over the years. So what we're going to do is we're going to rebend these pins back up. And as well, we are going to be doing a full recap and a cleaning of the board. As you can see here, the spot where you put in the 72-pin connector is a little bit nasty. It's not like super gross, but I'm not confident in this making good electrical contact. So the first order of business is we are going to be prepping this board for a recap, and then we'll move on to refurbishing the 72-pin connector. So let's get to it. Okay, so I have zoomed in here the modulator board here, and the reason why is because I would like to remove this in preparation of getting the whole thing recapped. Now, I've seen videos of people removing this, and usually what they'll do is they'll run these over with like some desolder braid or a desolder pump, and then they'll come in with a flathead screwdriver and just pop it out. Please, for the love of God, do not do that. When you do that, you run the risk of either damaging the board or, worse yet, lifting the traces here. And that just means that you'll add more work for yourself than is actually necessary. So the proper way of doing this is that we're going to hit all these points with some flux, some fresh solder, and we're going to remove the most of the solder with this, just a cheap desolder pump. You can use a desolder gun for these pins here, but you're not going to be able to suck up the solder with a desolder gun with these pins here, due to the fact that they're just larger and these are the pads that are going to soak up the most heat. For these, not only are we going to be using a desolder pump to remove the majority of the solder, but we're also going to run it over with some 3mm wide desolder wick, just to make sure that we soak up as much, if not all, the solder out of these holes, so that way it should just be able to pop out with ease. And as well, to ensure that we get proper thermal transfer, we need a thick tip and set our iron to 320 degrees Celsius, because this is a really thick board, so this thing is going to soak up a lot of heat. So we want to make sure that our tip is large enough to apply adequate thermal transfer. So without further delay, let's get started. Alright, so we got all of the solder extracted from all those through-hole parts, and if we did this right, it should just wiggle out. Just gonna... like so. And we can check the other side to make sure, and yep, no damage to the top or bottom plating. That is a clean extraction. Okay, so now that we got the modulator board removed, all we need to do now is delit it. And how do we delit it? Well, simply put, just grab and pull from each corner, and then it'll pop out eventually. Be careful though, the edges can be a bit sharp, so you can't cut yourself, but generally speaking, as long as you go easy, don't apply too much force, you should be able to just pop them out like so. Okay, so taking a look at this is a revision of the modulator board where it's actually easier to access the caps from the top. Some revisions of this will actually have capacitors stored underneath, which if that was the case, we would have to desolder everything here in order to get access to those caps. But in this case, we should be able to get access to the one hidden cap with just our tweezers here. And as well, my friend provided me a replacement voltage regulator and a replacement bridge rectifier. Now, these two parts aren't necessary unless they're blown, but given the fact that he wanted a kind of factory fresh feel, I'm just gonna go ahead and replace these two parts anyways. So let's get to it. Okay, so now that we got the modulator board taken apart, we now need to determine what capacitors we need from our front loader cap kit for this board. So looking at it, we need a 2200 microfarad 25 volt capacitor, a 100 microfarad 10 volt capacitor, a 100 microfarad 16 volt capacitor, and a 10 microfarad 35 volt capacitor. So that's all the caps that we need for this modulator board. So let's get everything extracted, including the regulator and the bridge rectifier. Alright, and with that, the modulator board is complete. Now, I'm sorry for the footage going blurry when I was screwing in the regulator or me going off camera with some of the capacitors here. Unfortunately, this board is a little further from my viewing distance, so sometimes I have a habit of looking at the board directly and forgetting, oh wait, I still gotta film it. But in any case, so a couple things I wanted to note before I forget. When installing the bridge rectifier, your positive pin, which you can see the little plus there, your positive pin is always going to be the longest pin of the 4. So make sure you do line that up correctly. Otherwise, you might end up putting it in backwards and, well, you end up destroying your bridge rectifier. And in addition, in terms of like how I can identify the polarity of the capacitors, in terms of like, where I position them, is the colored inside or the white side of the silk screening here is going to be your negative, and the non-colored side is going to be your positive. So just keep that in mind when you're putting in your capacitors. So with that, everything else is pretty much done. So all we need to do is take our lids out. Be careful of the pins there. And good. So now we can move on to the main board. Okay, so now that I have the main board here, we can now turn our attention to these 3 capacitors here. So if we were to look at our baggie, you may notice that we have more capacitors in our bag than we do on our board that need to be replaced. And the reason for that is these 3 capacitors will always be the same, but the capacitors in the modulator board will be different depending on the manufacturer, the PCB type, and you may end up having to replace more caps, less caps, or just different caps altogether. So that out of the way though, let's take a look at what 3 caps we need to replace here. So we have here a 100 microfarad 6.3 volt capacitor, a 2.2 microfarad 50 volt capacitor, and a 1 microfarad 50 volt capacitor. So looking at our baggie here, you may see that we do have a 1 microfarad 50 volt capacitor here. We do have a 2.2 microfarad, which I actually already separated, but we only have 100 microfarad 25 volt capacitors here. So when I looked at where this capacitor is, it seems to be between 5 volts and ground. That may be fine, but in keeping close to the original spec, I have here a 100 microfarad 10 volt capacitor from Nishikon. Now, when providing your own capacitors, it is very important that you get your capacitors from reputable sources and they are of quality brands. So in the case of reputable sources, I like to go to Mouser and DigiKey, and in case of reputable brands, what I like to use are Nishikon, Rubicon, and Panasonic capacitors. There are other good brands for capacitors out there. I think one of them is called Worth Electronics, which produces some really nice red capacitors, but this is just the one that I could find at this moment. So we have our 100 microfarad, our 2.2 microfarad, and our 1 microfarad. So let's get these 3 capacitors off the board and get these 3 capacitors on the board. Alright, and with that, the main board is now fully recapped. Now you may have noticed that I was struggling a little bit with these two capacitors, and that's mainly because the positive through holes were not clearing out well enough for me to feed the capacitor through. But eventually I was able to clear the holes and get the capacitors in. And you may have also noticed this capacitor is laying flat, and that is in the event that my friend ever decides to revisit this system and install like a NES RGB or a high-def NES. So for those installs, you have to make sure this capacitor is laying flat so it doesn't obstruct the secondary board that you have to install. Now with that out of the way, all that's left for the main board is getting the modulator board installed and getting it all cleaned up. And then once we finish with that, we can move on to the next part, which is refurbishing the 72 pin connector. So let's get that modulator installed and get this board all scrubbed up. So now that I have the main board completed, we can now focus on the final piece of the puzzle, and that's this, the original 72 pin connector. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, can't you just get a replacement 72 pin connector? You could just buy them off eBay, AliExpress, Amazon, and what have you. And while that is true, and that would technically be easier, I would highly recommend that you don't do that. And the reason why is because even though they look identical, the replacement 72 pin connectors are not built the same way as these original 72 pin connectors. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, you'll notice that as soon as you plug it into your system and you try to put in a game, you'll see that as soon as you put the game in, the cartridge will actually sink downward a bit, and that's not normal for a replacement 72 pin connector to be doing. So, since they're not built up to spec, we're just going to have to reuse the original. Now, there are some cases where you don't have a choice in the matter, like say that your original is busted or corroded, or maybe in the event that you bought a used NES, for some reason they didn't put one in. So in those cases, I understand. But in this case, since we do have the original and it's in pretty good condition otherwise, we're just gonna refurbish it. Now, the way that we're going to do so is that we are going to have to bend all of these pins upward using a craft knife. But before we even do that, we need to clean this thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using 91% isopropyl alcohol. I would recommend using deoxit as that would be a little better, but this is just what I have on hand at this moment. And in addition, I'm going to be using these. Now, this is the Naki Eliminator. This is a tool that is specifically made for cleaning cartridge-based systems, or in this case, the NES. And that's actually what this part is also for. This is from a different cartridge cleaning tool, but point is, if you want an easier time cleaning cartridge systems, get a cartridge cleaning tool that is made for your system. So since I'm cleaning an NES cartridge connector, I need an NES cartridge connector cleaner. So without further delay, let's get started. Okay, so now that we have the 72 pin connector all cleaned, we can now move forward with bending the pins back up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our craft knife here, and this one is a rather dull blade, but that's okay. We just need something nice and thin to wedge between this plastic spacer and the pin itself. Once you get the blade in, just simply gently pull the pin up. Try not to apply pressure to the plastic spacer here, but you just want to gently pull it up, and it should look like that. And you just do it to the rest of these pins. Okay, now that we have all the necessary pins bent up, there's only one step left, and that is we're going to try our best to even things out here, because you may notice that a lot of the pins aren't necessarily evenly bent up, and that's okay, because what we're going to do is we're going to take this Game Genie here, and we're just going to cram it in. And the reason why is because the Game Genie here has a rather thick PCB, but because of that, that means that it should help flatten out the pins a bit, and, you know, even it out some. So we're just going to take our Game Genie here and just press it in, kind of wiggle it a bit, and just pull out. Do this a couple more times. Looks like it did a pretty good job. And then we're just going to take our isopropyl or deoxit and just hit it once more with the cartridge cleaner. Alright, and with that, the 72 pin connector is all done. Now all that's left is to put the NES back together and test it. Okay, so we're focused here on the bottom of the NES casing, and the reason why is I would like to do a partial reassembly of the system so that way we can test it and make sure it works before we commit to a full reassembly. But something else that I wanted to bring attention real quick is this. This is the NES cartridge sled, and more importantly, I want to bring to attention this lip of plastic that's underneath the NES cartridge sled. Now, when people put the system back together, I have seen time and again where people will just put the tray in, put in your screws, and call it a day. Pay close attention to that lip of plastic. It needs to go in a specific way. If you just slide it in all willy-nilly, you end up with the lip of plastic on the top side of the board, or rather the bottom side of the board, depending on how you're looking at it, when it needs to go in like this. If you don't put it in correctly, what ends up happening is that you'll notice that your cartridge tray doesn't latch anymore, And what some people have done is they'll loosen the screws just to make sure it latches. You shouldn't have to loosen your screws for this to latch. If you put it in correctly, it will latch just fine. If you leave it like that, what ends up happening is you'll either end up damaging the latch, breaking the latch, or in the worst case scenario, you'll crack the board. So just keep that in mind when putting your NES back together. Now, in terms of screwing it back together, we're only going to be using 4 screws. 2 smaller screws here, and the 2 longer screws that go here. So, like this, and this, as well as, it's a little difficult to get in here, this, and this. So we're just going to screw these 4 screws in, so that way we can have everything kind of secured, so that way we can begin testing this unit. Okay, so I have the system partially reassembled here. Got the 4 screws all screwed down, the power and reset module hooked up, and I got my video, audio, and power hooked up to the system as well. So let's make sure that the system works. Looks like it does. Good. Now, there's a reason why I only did a partial reassembly, and that's because if I need to do any additional tuning to the system, I can quickly remove the screws, take out the 72-pin cartridge connector, do some extra tuning, and then put it back on. And the big reason for that is because of this. Now, when I test my NES front loaders, I usually go through a gauntlet of 10 random games from my collection. And if everything is cleaned and tuned correctly, it should read all 10 of these games without any issues. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be these 10 games specifically, just 10 games that you know work. So, without further delay, let's begin. Oh, and also one more thing. If you tuned this 72-pin connector correctly, you should be able to play the game without having to press down on it, which should help with the lifespan of the 72-pin connector. So, let's see if we're that lucky. And look at that. Looks like we are. No need to press down anymore. Just works as is. All right, next game. Works. 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 Sorry, I almost pressed it down. Works. 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 And works. But now to do it in reverse, because sometimes it can read a game the first time, but not the second time. So, works. Sorry, I'm also trying to be mindful of where the stack is. Works. 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 Let me see if it just needs to be readjusted a little bit. Looks like it does. And that's fine. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be tuned. Just the nature of cartridge systems, sometimes you need to just fiddle with it a little bit for it to work. Now, if I had to really work at it, like had to press down, press up, and then jiggle it a lot more, then yeah, I would need to do some extra tuning. But so far, it looks like everything checks out. So yeah, this passes the 10 game test. So now we can take it apart so that way I could put the rest of the bottom shielding as well as all the bottom components in and reassemble this unit. So let's get to it. Just a quick note before we proceed on with reassembling the system. You may notice with the controller ports, you have two controller ports of identical shape in the front, but the cablings aren't the same. And what I mean by that is one is shorter than the other. So when putting the controller ports back on your system, if you did remove them, the shorter one goes in player 1 and the longer one goes in player 2. And you get the idea. And the easiest way to remember that is when you put the board back, the shortest one is the one that gets plugged into the closest port, while the longer one, which is our player 2, gets plugged into the side here, which is much further away from the front. So just something to keep in mind. Just one more thing to note while we are finishing up here with reassembly. There are going to be two different types of screws used here for the 72 pin connector. The longer screws, which you can see that they are physically longer than the normal screws, go to the bottommost holes, while the regular size screws go to the topmost screws. The reason why is because this threads to the screw posts on the bottom shell, while this just locks the 72 pin connector in place. So, just gonna screw this in real quick. Sorry about that, but there we go. And the reason why I bring that up is because another common mistake that I've seen is they'll mix up where these long screws go, and sometimes they end up threading it into the wrong hole, which may result in anything between nothing happening, which is what would happen if you thread it through here, or you may end up with divots in the plastic if you thread it in, say, these screw posts here. So let's just get the top shielding on and finish reassembly. At long last, the Nintendo Entertainment System is fully completed. We got the system recapped, as well as the 7805 upgraded to the 78S05, and we even replaced the bridge rectifier. And as well, we now have a nice, stable connection with our 72-pin connector. Now, this is just my copy of Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers, and as you can see, I'm able to control it just fine with player 1, as well as player 2. Let me see if I can, there we go. So yeah, that's really it. Now, if you guys liked what you saw, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and stick around. I have more videos coming along the way, and as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.